right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the True Life Podcast. Hope your day is going beautiful. What you got to see right there in the beginning were some very interesting sort of three-dimensional geometric sort of a little slideshow there. If you look up on the left corner, I'm going to play another because I want everyone to see these images. I think that if you can understand a little bit of these images, just take a look at them and watch them play here. Let's see if we can get it going. So it plays again a little bit. Okay, and I'll pull the volume down. So there. Now, if you see up in the corner there, you know what? Let me just pull it down. Need for this right now. Okay. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to talk a little bit about the abstract geometric forms. And the reason I think those forms are important is that the abstract geometric forms are integrated in the thought process. You ever think about that? We spend so much time on verbal linguistics and language, and we think in language, we think in words. But what if we didn't? What if we're also thinking in imagery? And I have this idea that I've been working with. And for those who know me, everybody knows I'm a huge fan of psychedelics. I'm a huge fan of alternate states of consciousness. And whether you have enjoyed a psychedelic experience or whether or not, I believe that you have encountered these three-dimensional geometric sort of visions. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you just went like this, if you just closed your eyes and kind of rubbed them like that, you would begin to see like little flickers sometimes. They call those phosphenes. Or you could see sort of a blotchy image. Everybody, if you just take your fingers and do something like this, like you can see some odd like lights or like some imagery or some colors begin to form. Like those are the images that we see on the back of our eyelids. And my somewhat of a hypothesis here, I'm still working with it, so just hear me out. Here's what I have. My hypothesis is that phosphenes or entopic lights and flashes that characterize our experience when we shut our eyes, which we just explained, or become aware of the fading of after images or the play of lights. I believe that these multidimensional geometric shapes one sees in the open eye and closed eye visuals of a psychedelic trip are you ready for this? To some degree, organizational and coding patterns. Does that kind of make sense? So let me just take you through a heightened sense of awareness on a psychedelic trip. Like let's say you've eaten 7 grams of mushrooms or you've taken some LSD. And for those of us who have been in that situation, sometimes you have these beautiful open eye visuals and they're like a tesseract or a sort of diamond that's 3 to 4 dimensional and is changing shape, or it's a mandala. Like what are those? Like I've thought long and hard about what those things can be. And the more that I think about it, the more that I think it's like a language or at least some sort of coding or organizational pattern. You know what I mean by that? Like it's coding something. It's showing us something. It is almost like a language. And the reason I think it's a lot like a language, we're going to get into this book, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. I think it's directly affected or directly related to language. And I believe if we start seeing or at least relating the visual imagery that we have to language, then we can solve problems better. And I know that sounds just like a lot of words coming out of my mouth, but think about the geometrical shapes and think about the problems in your life. Think about a 3-dimensional cube, right? It has all these different angles and all these different patterns and everything is connected. Well, that's the same thing with the problems in our life. If you have a problem in a relationship, you can get a good understanding of that problem by taking a step back and understanding all the things that affect that relationship. It's not just the words you said to somebody. It's just not the actions that somebody did. It goes a lot deeper than that. And so that's kind of, I wanted to get that out there before I started reading, because I think that everyone at some point in time has felt that or seen that. And if you haven't, I want people to understand this. It seems in the West, or that in today's world of Western thought, you and me, professors, scientists, people at corporations, we seem to emphasize verbal or language processing process as being of a higher order than auditory or visual imagery. And I think that that is bullshit. I think we should start focusing, at least on some level, on the visual imagery that we see, whether it's a closed eye visual or an open eye visual or an auditory hallucination. I think that those have a lot to do with communications. Okay, so that was the beginning. Here we go. I'm going to jump into this book. This is about this part of the book is going to be about stream of consciousness as a psychological problem. If we are to examine altered or alternate states of consciousness, should we not first respond to the challenge William James posed in his famous chapter, The Stream of Thought? Even if one questions James' metaphor of the flowing river as a felicitous description of ongoing consciousness, a little careful introspection should raise questions about whether the traditional rubrics of perception, sensation, and imagery suffice to capture the complexity of private experience. To anybody but a psychologist, it would seem amazing indeed that textbooks on thinking can't ignore the stream of consciousness and imagination, that books on personality or on adolescence can say so little about imagination or fantasy. I want to pause there for a minute. This book it's a little bit older, and as you can see, the statistics that they're citing or the papers they're citing are from the 70s, but I think it's still really relevant today. Let me ask you this question. When you have listened to a psychologist, when you've gotten a book, or when you have read anything on adolescence or thoughts or textbooks on thinking, how much of those books have been dedicated to imagination or consciousness or personality? Just hold on to that for a little bit. After a half century of repression, at least imagery is back in and a fit subject for formal psychological research. Ongoing thought remains, however, relatively neglected and primary, the domain of the fine artist. So we're seeing a reemergence, I think, of ongoing or stream of consciousness thought. Whether it's Eckhart Tolle or whether it's your favorite Buddhist philosopher, you always hear this idea of be here now. What do they mean, be here now? Well, they're talking about the past doesn't exist, and nor does the future. All you really have is this time in front of you. And if that's true, think about the language you use: past tense, present tense, and then the stream of consciousness would represent the tense in which we are now. So, on some level, all you have is the stream of consciousness, because when you begin to explain to someone else what happened in the past, what you're really doing is trying to provide them with your subjective understanding of what happened. It's not a real tangible thing. And the same is true of the present. All that you really have right now is an opportunity to explain to people what you see in front of you. So let me move on to the next page here. So I've got this new camera I'm working with, so bear with me here. Okay. Indeed, it was the creative personalities of literature, painting, and cinema who took up James' challenge initially. The excitement engendered in the first 2 decades of this century by the efforts of James Joyce to produce what Edmund Wilson called perhaps the most faithful X-ray ever taken of the ordinary human consciousness, reflected. Oh, sorry about that. My cats are going nuts. So, reflected the seriousness with which writers accepted James's insights. So here's a beautiful excerpt from Virginia Woolf. Let me see if I can get that a little closer. Okay, here we go. Examine for a moment an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. The mind receives a myriad of impressions, trivial, fantastic, evanescent, or engraved with the sharpness of steel. From all sides they come, an incessant shower of innumerable atoms. And as they fall, as they shape themselves, get down, buddy. Sorry about that. As they shape themselves into the life of Monday or Tuesday, the ascent falls differently from the old. Life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged, but an luminous halo, a semi-transparent envelope surrounding us from the beginning of consciousness to the end. At the same time that James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and T.S. Eliot, in his discussion of the objective correlative, were forming the basis for the use of stream of consciousness as a literary and poetic medium, filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein perceived an opportunity in motion pictures to capture even more effectively the ongoing thought stream. Okay, I'm going to pause again. One of the things I really like about this book is in some ways you can see the evolution of thought happening just with me reading this. I'm going to just read this first part just again so you guys can understand. What I'm reading to you is the evolution of thought, the evolution of the way we see the world. It's going to blow your mind. At the same time that James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and T.S. Eliot, this is 1950, in his discussion of the objective correlative, were forming the basis for the use of the stream of consciousness as a literary and poetic medium. Think about the books that they have written. Think about, whether it's Ulysses or whether, it's any one of those. Filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein perceived an opportunity in motion pictures to capture even more effectively the ongoing thought stream. In his development of montage and in his effort to produce by what he called partial representations, images that would evoke for a viewer the same ongoing thought experience as occurred in the mind of the artist or of the character represented on the screen. So think about that. If we look back to film, I don't remember which film this was or what year it was, but I heard stories about one of the first moving pictures was this train on the screen, and people are sitting in the theaters, and there's this train, and as it's coming towards the screen, people that were sitting in the movie theaters were really freaked out. They didn't really have that idea of perspective, so they thought the train was going to come through the big screen and run them over. They'd never seen it before, and you and I laugh about it like it's a joke, but imagine seeing that for the first time. And I'm going to bring it up to speed. One of the earliest scenes I remember where I got to see a movie from a different perspective was Pulp Fiction. It was one of the first times they did these crazy jump cuts, and you kind of got to see what people were thinking. You kind of got to see the mind of John Travolta when he's all slammed out on heroin. There was another good one too that was about gosh damn it, I should have written that down. We'll just stick with Pulp Fiction for now. But yeah, if you think back to the movies that you like, if you think back to the movies that have really blown your mind or the books that you've written, they've provided you with a mental image that was a different perspective than you were used to, than you were aware of. And so are those not alternate states of consciousness? Think about the movies. Like, let's just take Pulp Fiction again for a minute. Think about that movie when you see Bruce Willis at the fight. I forgot his name in the movie, but you see him fighting the heavyweight champion and he loses, and then he goes, and just think about the different scenes, the way it jumps back and forth. For me, that was one of the first times I saw these jump cuts, and it really changed my idea of what movies can be. And once that movie came out, you saw everybody else beginning to take up that technique. Well, the same is true for the way we think. The same is true for a idea or a stream of consciousness. Have you ever gone to a seminar or sat down in front of an impassionate or an incredible speaker, and it almost changes the way you see the room? It almost changes your relationship with the people next to you when someone is an incredible speaker. How are they doing that? Well, they're taking their words and they're transforming them into ideas for you to experience. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but if you stick with me in this book, we're going to figure out how they do it. Okay. So this is a little bit about what we talked about in the beginning. Overemphasis on verbal and directed thought. Lacking the artist's freedom from the constraints of scientific method, behavioral scientists have focused much more on the products of specific directed thinking or on the study of isolated features of thought, such as the vividness of images, the effectiveness of imagery in paired associate learning, and other forms of problem solution. By their very nature, the methods of the experimental psychologist have led perhaps to an overweighing of the structured, directed, rational aspects of thought. Now, think about that for a minute. Okay. What does that make when you think about that? Tariq, what up? Thanks for commenting. I love it. When I look at this passage, when I think about the overemphasis on verbal and directed thought, I think of specialization. When you think of someone who is overemphasizing the verbal and directed thought, they go right down and they just cut through everything and they focus like a laser beam on a problem, or they focus like a laser beam on, you know, something very particular. And that seems to me to be synonymous with the ideas of what are they, like, specialization, right? Like, think about all the doctors that we have. Like, it used to be you would go to a general practitioner and he could pretty much do a lot of things. And if he couldn't fix it, then he would send you to a specialist. But nowadays, there's like the specialist. If you have a problem with the fifth disc on your lower back, there's a specific doctor you need to see. If you have a problem with a certain set of hormones, then there's a certain endocrinologist that you might want to go to. But it's this incredible specialization that I think stems from the overemphasis on verbal and directed thought. And maybe I'm the only one that thinks this is out of control, amazing, but isn't it weird? The way our culture thinks, the way our culture speaks is in fact the way our culture is shaped. And if that is true, and if you can draw a parallel between verbal and directed thought and the overemphasis, if you can draw that straight line right to specialization, well, we can see where it goes. It's leading to an inability to communicate. It's leading to a world where everything is so specialized. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And it sure seems like that now, right? So let's go through, and there's going to be some answers that we can get to, or at least some ideas of how we could live in a better life or create a better environment for ourselves if we learn how to change our thought patterns. Studies of concept learning, or of abstraction abilities of various forms of categorical thinking and of arithmetic or spatial problem solution, have predominated because they are easy to conduct and control. I'm thinking of clinical trials. It has been only in recent years that the ethical thinking of individuals has been subjected to more careful study, or the private judgments about human relationships have been examined systematically. Even these researchers are generally cast within the very structured format of problem solution. The picture of the thought process that emerges, therefore, has a quality of organization and rationality that does not always fit either with the fine description of writers or with our private experience if we take the trouble to observe it unfold in a natural course. This part I think is really interesting. I think you're going to like this. Let me get a little water. Excuse me for a minute. Okay. The contributions of psychoanalysis, significant as they have been in opening up a broader range of attention to the subtleties of thought and the irrational, wishful, and selfish side of private experience, have not fully addressed the nature of ongoing thought. As conscious as Freud was of the many persisting intrusions into adult mental processes of childlike magical solutions or fantasies, he still tended to assume, and we know what that does, it appears that the well analyzed adult would be characterized by a much greater resort to secondary process thinking. Okay, that's a lot of words. Let me just tell you this. What kind of, excuse my language, but what the fuck are you talking about? Secondary process thinking. These guys go on, or it seems to me that as we move down this paragraph, the people that were the thought leaders 20, 30 years ago that were really emphasizing directed thought, that were really emphasizing this verbal linguistic path, they believed that the secondary ideas of thinking were mental imagery. And like that's how we kind of got down this road of specialization, at least in my opinion. It might be argued that Freud overplayed the logical and rational quality of mature waking thought and underestimated the adaptive and directed quality of wishful, image related thinking. So I know that that could be confusing for some people. Think about it like this: whenever you're solving a problem, how many random thoughts come in your head? Have you ever thought about the random thoughts that come in your head when you're trying to do something else? Like, let's say, for example, I'm doing some dishes, and all of a sudden, the random thought of me, like, I don't know, pulling my cat's tail, like that thought pops in my head. Or, oh, wow, I wish I was surfing right now. Just these random thoughts that seem to have nothing to do with what you're doing. They seem to be irrelevant to the task you're doing. Like, what are those thoughts? Well, a lot of people think that they're task irrelevant, but I believe, and I think this book is going to show that, in fact, they are relevant. There are no random thoughts that pop in your head. The thoughts that pop up into your head are necessary in order to get the job done. Even though you're doing dishes and you start thinking about your cat, that is a necessary thought in order for you to finish the dishes. I know what you're thinking. How, George? How is that even relevant? Why is my cat relevant to the dishes? Because every thought is tied to the entirety of what you're trying to do. Okay, so hold that in your head and watch now here. This little thing again. I'm gonna put this up, and, and I think that this is a much okay. Can you see here? So again, different thoughts that seem to be random are like the thought on the outside of the geometric shapes. Every thought you think about your happiness, your slavery, your books, your bed, all the thoughts you have are related the same way the lines on these geometrical images are related. And that is exactly why, if we begin to pay more attention to our abstract geometric forms, it'll help us with our language. It'll help us with our life. It'll help us understand, categorize, and see patterns better. I'm going to play it again up here because I really want people to think about that. Look at all the different shapes, like everything sits. Even if you think something is completely irrelevant, even if you think it has nothing to do with the other, it is relevant. It's all connected. And the more time you spend thinking about how you think, the better you will. Let's say, as this is playing up here, I want you guys to think about it. I'm going to play it one more time, and I'm going to say a little bit of a mantra. If you drive this point home, I think it can make your life better. So here we go again, okay? So the plans with which one approaches one's own awareness of ongoing private experience determine the extent ability of increased complexity of associated structures. You get it? I know, probably not, because those are a lot of big words and I strung them together right there. Let me just kind of put it in a different way. The way you think about thinking, metacognition, they call that, the way you experience your own awareness of your own ideas and your own private thought, they, to a great extent, increase your ability to understand your relationship about everything. And that's why I started off this whole process, this whole video today about abstract geometric forms and how they deal with the way we think. Okay, let's get back to the book a little bit. Okay, here's another good point that I want to talk to people about. In order to talk about that, let me start at this page, though. Okay. I'm going to recap a little bit. Indeed, it might be argued that Freud overplayed the logical and rational quality of mature waking thought and underestimated the adaptive and directed quality of wishful, imagery-laden thinking. Freud's theory of thinking represents perhaps the first elaborate effort to develop a comprehensive view of mental process. Yet various structures, characteristics, of the theory, id, ego, superego, unconscious, preconscious, conscious, primary and secondary process, are all too difficult to fit together since they were developed at different times and never were brought into correspondence. Some attempted modifications of this excessively rational view. How many of you live a rational life? Mature thought process was introduced by analysts such as Ernst Chris, who proposed that at least for creative thought, one had to look for regression in the service of the ego. Just think about the way they speak about thinking. It's so dry and so just without any sort of I don't without any sort of real clear guys, it's difficult for me to explain. Let's just keep reading and you guys tell me what you think. Again, the term regression seems to continue the earlier emphasis on the directed, rational, secondary process quality of mature adult thought to assert that the poet who can recapture early childhood memories or fantasies, but who can also make unusual and odd combinations from current experiences, is relying on a more childlike mode of thought seems very unsatisfactory. This approach seems, for one thing, to emphasize verbal or language process as being of a higher order than auditory or visual imagery content in adult thinking. Certainly, this prejudice is pervasive among professionals, largely because they depend so much on the ultimate verbal expression of material in print. Yeah, it's pretty juvenile to think that a poet or someone who is able to recapture early childhood memories or fantasies is less than or is more childlike of a thinker than someone who has a completely rational idea and set of linguistics that is devoid of any imagination. It would seem unlikely that the brain of a Beethoven or a Bach, teeming with melody, with novel and original combinations of themes, instrumental coloration, and interweaving lines of music, represents a somehow more primitive style of thought than that of a mathematician mentally solving algebra problems. Again, we see the emphasis on the rational, the idea that solving mathematical algebra problems is somehow a greater source of mental horsepower than interweaving lines of music. Or our recent heightened awareness of the differential processing capabilities of the brain and its functional asymmetry for verbal, quantitative, and spatial representational capacities suggests that the process of effective thought is far more complex than has been recognized. In addition, if one frees oneself from the hydraulic energy model that has characterized so much of the theory about thinking in this century and opens up the way for an information processing model, one can free also of the oversimplified primary/secondary process of regression views that have been part of that model. A basic problem in understanding ongoing human thought has to do, of course, with the fact that we inevitably rely on some aspect of language to determine the nature of private experience. That part I think is really important. I'm going to read it again just because I want to be able to recite that. And if you're listening to this, you should definitely try to learn this one little section right here. A basic problem in understanding ongoing human thought has to do, of course, with the fact that we inevitably rely on some aspect of language to determine the nature of private experience. This makes the task, this makes the report on thinking often very much subject to the demands of the given task. Most people who have written about thought in the past, with the exception of the psychoanalysts, have tended to value logic and analytic capacities and have attempted to adopt the most formal aspects of communication. This emphasis has led them almost inevitably to ignore the many intrusions of visual and auditory or other images into their thinking in the interest of providing a refined product. Similarly, by the setting of tasks, such as the forming of concepts, often using abstract geometric forms themselves, alien to most people's day to day experience, they have seriously underestimated the degree to which most thinking has to do with interpersonal situations and human relationships. That's the point I was trying to drive home earlier with the idea about abstract geometric forms. When you think about the abstract geometric forms, I believe you're beginning to get a real idea of how relationships work. All you need to do is find a geometric form. Let's play this piece again up here. Okay. Play it again, Sam. Here we go. This- Now, when you see form and or to see how all the images, how the triangles and how everything fits together, like that's a real. The way in which those geometric images are fit together, so too are they, and they all affect one another. If the seed or if the dark outline or the negative space is gone, the image doesn't work or it doesn't work as well. Let's watch it again. I think it's fascinating. You see, and these are a lot of the same imagery. This kind of imagery is what's been lacking in education. This kind of imagery is what's relationships to people. I think that there's certain geometric images that correspond perfectly to certain there, but I'm working on trying to figure it out. You know, you if, if you there's a really good image of Google and it'll show you the way in which the object is moving. I think that we should be studying geometric forms so that we can better understand how relationships work. And I think that's going to be, that would be a great class, right? Like that would be something that a lot of people could not only speculate on, but they could draw out a mental map of their relationships by using the geometric imagery as sort of a guide. And it would be interesting to see if different people came up with different ways to use those images. Okay. So let's move right over here. Let's talk about approaches to studying ongoing thought. We are finally beginning to get some kinds of data that at least open the way for studies of ongoing mental process. One group of approaches has involved questionnaires and inventories dealing with experiences of daydreaming and related imaginal experiences as they occur over one's life. These questionnaires, though on the whole yielding relatively consistent findings, are of course based upon retrospective reporting of dispositions to experience different types of daydreaming, the conditions under which these daydreams occur, and the relationship of the daydreams to other personality characteristics. Nevertheless, the large body of data accumulated makes it clear that most respondents report considerable amounts of ongoing thought characterized by a variety of wishes, anticipations, and fearful expectations. Striking and apparently consistent individual differences in types and patternings of such ongoing thought are evident also. Perhaps a more direct approach of capturing the ongoing stream of thought has emerged from a series of laboratory investigations that have the virtue of relatively strong control over external input, but at the same time suffer from some of the inevitable artificiality of laboratory, like things set and setting there. The studies have used as their approach the assignment of the subject to the task of detecting signals in a relatively circumscribed sensory environment so that the external cues available are more or less under experimental control. By interrupting people systematically while they are busy involved in detecting rapidly presented signals, one can obtain estimates of the degree to which thoughts and images extraneous to the task occurs spontaneously to the subject. It is thus possible to measure within the limitations of these situations the extent to which other kinds of thinking are going on besides strict attention to a task that is not in itself intellectually demanding. Every 15 seconds, subjects report systemically the occurrences, non occurrences of stimulus independent or task irrelevant thought, or provide verbal accounts of those thoughts that did occur. These reports can be recorded and later rated along appropriate classification dimensions. It is possible to build up considerable information on how much else is going on when an individual is presumably devoting primary attention to an assigned, externally derived task. It's interesting, right? Have you guys ever been in a situation where you're trying to solve a problem and you've just been staring at the page and you can't figure it out, and then you take a break and then all of a sudden the answer kind of comes to you? Or sometimes you find yourself faced with a pretty big issue, you sleep on it, and you wake up the next day and you have it. It's interesting to think how that's related. Why is that related? It's it's a process. I don't know. It's gotta. I think the answers lie in the geometric shapes. I think the more that we study these geometric forms, the more we understand about our own thought process, the more we understand about how to get to the answer from an area that seems irrelevant. These studies have indicated again and again that even when subjects are attaining 90% accuracy in the detection of auditory or visual signals, they are nevertheless producing many extraneous thoughts. Indeed, one can relate the occurrence of such thoughts to a variety of parameters, including the information load of the detection task, the complexity of the task, the regularity of intervals between detection signals, the size of the gap between signals, the degree of unexpected information or stress presented to the subjects before entrance into the signal detection booths, and the personality characteristics of the subject. It seems likely not only that there is a good deal of task irrelevant thought going on much of the time, but also that such thought, although often somewhat fantastic or speculative, usually involves anticipation of future situations or reconstructions of past events that ultimately may have some value in guiding or steering behaviors for the future. That's interesting. When I read that, I I sometimes think about uh, like sometimes you have crazy thoughts. Like you start thinking about like, man, what if I just let me just keep reading before I go way down some crazy rabbit hole. More recently, there have been attempts to study ongoing thought even more directly, without the necessity for assignment of the subject to a single detection task. And especially the intriguing approaches followed by C's. I'm not even going to try. This investigator and his collaborators have been concerned with studying the ongoing flow of behavior, more generally, and especially what he calls automatic behaviors, actions that are not in themselves clearly directed towards satisfaction of the more basic drives or the economic motives of the human condition. By having persons log their ongoing behavior, including mental activity, C has been able to obtain some estimates for ongoing extraneous thought that bear on our present topic. For example, his data suggests that 2/3 of a group of 21 surgeons interviewed reported that they engaged in daydreaming, particularly during the more routine aspects of the surgery, such as sewing up an incision. Their daydreams touched on music, food, wine, and women. In one phase, the research subjects were encouraged to inhibit regularly reoccurring autotelic activities. Those subjects who spent much time daydreaming and then attempted to inhibit such behavior subsequently reported extremely negative affective reactions. If so much is indeed going on, it would seem that we ought to address ourselves more systematically to the stream of consciousness as a base for altered states of consciousness. Let me just back that up a little bit. Isn't it fascinating that the people who tried to suppress their daydreams, those subjects spent much time trying to inhibit that behavior, all of those people reported extremely negative affective reactions. So it's almost like trying to focus as hard as you can may not be the best way to get anything done, which flies in the face of so much of what we've been taught over the last 20 years. If so much is indeed going on, it would seem that we ought to address ourselves more systematically to the stream of consciousness as a base for altered states of consciousness. It's interesting to think that you talking to someone, you speaking to your neighbor, your lover, your kid, your teacher, whatever, that stream of consciousness that you are in fact taking part in is an altered state of consciousness. It's interesting to think about, right? It seems likely that the baseline or tonic characteristics of normal thought involve a range and variety of intrusions of images and interior monologues of retrospective or perspective scenes played out with greater or less vividness, and that all of these are subject to different degrees of attention, depending on the external task demands. Do you guys think that the different degrees of attention are altered states of consciousness? That's a pretty good question. It depends on how much attention you're giving something, I guess. I guess that would be an altered state of consciousness. Okay, let's keep moving. Functions and characteristics of ongoing thought. As a baseline for consciousness, one may begin by taking into account the vast storage capacities of the brain and their special qualities. The vastness of the brain's storage capacity has been amply demonstrated in many recent experiments on the amazing effectiveness of recognition memory. This storage activity may involve not only sensory content, but also presumably some degree of organization of material. Bartlett demonstrated ingeniously that environmental sounds that cannot easily be identified or labeled may still be stored as organizations rather than as purely sensory components for later recognition. I shall not attempt here to deal with the neurophysiological or neurochemical aspects of the storage process, other than to suggest the likelihood that storage is not in a place. Mhm. It's an interesting concept, right? So the way something, it's not where something is stored, it's the way something is stored. See, if you just take time, like think about that. It's not storage is not a place, except within the left or right hemisphere, depending whether it is verbal, digital, sequential, or imagery analogic, but rather is accomplished through some more active, relatively continuous recycling process. The brain is very likely fairly active at all times. And in a sense, we must train ourselves not to heed the workings of its machinery, just as we must learn not to notice the many gurglings of the stomach, the twitching of the toes, and the spontaneous firings of various nerve endings that occur all the time as we go about our day to day activities. The activity of the brain can be attested to by night dream research, which yields content reports from subjects interrupted at all stages of sleep. In effect, then, the assumption leads to the likelihood that part of our sensory environment must include the ongoing activity of our own brain, which is expressed in the form of recurring, perhaps even randomly occurring, images in various modalities and bits and pieces of stored conversation. It seems conceivable that such activity represents a kind of noise in the system, an alternate source of stimulation to that produced by the physical stimuli of the external environment. Indeed, one might conceive of a continuum of stimulation fields in which clearly measurable external noises or lights or smells represent one pole, Further on that scale might lie bodily aches and pains, or even more positive sensations that are less obvious to others, but still referable on the whole to physically measurable characteristics. Moving further internally, one might then have additional stimuli that are referable in part to the operation of peripheral processes. The phosphenes, or entopic lights and flashes that characterize our experience when we shut our eyes and become aware of the fading of after images, or of the play of lights and irregular geometric shapes on the interior of our eyelids, have been relatively neglected until recent years. See, here we're going to talk a little bit more about the phosphenes and geometric images on the back of your eyelids. Horowitz has pioneered in studying these phenomena and reporting on their implications for hallucinatory behavior. Further along the internal dimensions, we may have more complex matching of externally derived stimuli to relatively recent stimulations, held in short-term memory and some degree of organizational and coding activities. See, that is where I think the geometrical objects in a psychedelic trip are also doing. I think that they too could be organizational and coding activities. And I think that those same objects are coding for relationships, they're coding for understanding. And in doing so, there are more profound language. If you could learn to thoroughly understand the relationship of geometrical images to your own thinking, and then relay that diagram to someone else, I think the two of you could engage in a conversation about a subject that is vastly deeper and better and more organized and whatever other thing if you had that geometrical form that both of you agreed upon. It seems like a no-brainer to me. Still, further along the internal dimensions, we might find rehearsal and replay activities from long-term memory, some of them set off by external stimuli, as in the famous case of Marcel Proust's taste of Madeleine crumbs in his tea, which brought flooding back in a whole set of vivid imageries in the town of Combray. Perhaps most interior on the dimension would be associations, primarily to the most private material drawn from the long-term memory, or in the case of Proust associations, several steps removed from the initial taste of Madeleine's to sets of associations gathered almost completely from long-term memory. So there we are again with associations. I think when you look at the diagrams, let me just put them up here in the corner again. Associations, language, and relationships when you watch this stream, okay? Up in the top corner. Understand choices. See all the different shapes. They're all connected. We're losing everybody.